Welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. I grew up thinking that, who you are, was something you proved, not something you learned. In our house, identity wasn't a question you asked with curiosity. It was an answer you performed with consistency. My father had a quiet way of setting rules without ever speaking them. He never said, "Be a man," but the air around him was full of instructions. Men didn't linger in front of mirrors. Men didn't talk about feelings unless it was anger, and even then it was better delivered as a joke. Men didn't ask for help. Men handled things. And men, I understood early, did not drift towards softness. Softness was something you could appreciate in women, like a painting hung in someone else's room, but you didn't carry it around inside yourself. My mother loved me, I know she did. But she was tired in the way so many mothers are tired from trying to keep peace between personalities that never quite fit together. When I did something my father approved of, like fixing something small or standing up straight during a handshake, she looked relieved, as if I had safely crossed a road without seeing the oncoming traffic. When I did something my father didn't approve of, like crying after a fight at school or hesitating before a rough game with other boys, she looked afraid that I'd bring home consequences she wouldn't be able to soften. I was an observant kid. I learned the rules by studying reactions. Most kids learn by being told. I learned by watching what made adults relax and what made them tense. So I built myself like a project, a boy who could pass inspection. And then there was this other part, quiet and persistent, that didn't fit into any of the building plans. I don't have a single dramatic moment I can point to and say, that's where it began. It's more like a series of small curiosities, each one easy to dismiss, that formed a pattern I couldn't unsee once I was older. In elementary school, when costumes came up for plays or holidays, I felt a pull toward the clothes that looked lighter, freer, more expressive. I didn't have words like feminine yet. I just knew there was something about those fabrics and shapes that made my chest feel open, like I could breathe deeper. I remember being in my parents' room once when I was maybe 8 or 9, looking for a book or a charger, something harmless, and seeing my mother's closet slightly open. There were colors there that didn't exist in my own drawer, soft blues, warm reds, patterns that didn't apologize for being patterns. I stood in front of it longer than I needed to. Not because I wanted to steal anything or do something dramatic. Because it felt like standing near a door to another kind of life, a life where you were allowed to be tender without defending it. It took me a long time to admit that I wanted to try it, even privately. Wanting, in my family, was suspicious. Wanting made you vulnerable to disappointment. Wanting also made you vulnerable to judgment. So I learned to want in secret, and eventually I learned to punish myself for wanting it all. My first experiment was almost accidental, or at least that's the story I told myself. I was home alone for an hour after school. I'd had a rough day. Nothing catastrophic, just the slow ache of trying to be right all day, trying to match the energy around me, trying to be unbothered when I was bothered. I wandered into my parents' room, and without making a plan, I opened that closet. I pulled out a cardigan. It was simple, not flashy. I remember the weight of it in my hands, and how ordinary it looked. But when I slipped it on, something in me softened. Not in a sexual way. Not in an exciting secret way. In a way that felt like being held. It's hard to explain that to people who assume crossdressing is always about performance or attention. For me, it was the opposite. It was the first time I felt invisible in a good way, invisible from the role I was supposed to play. Like I could step out of the rigid outline and just exist. Then I heard a car door outside and panic hit me so fast I almost dropped the cardigan. My body reacted like I'd committed a crime. I yanked it off, folded it too quickly, shoved it back where it belonged, and stood in the hallway with my heart pounding as if danger had physically entered the house. Nothing happened. No one knew. But the shame stayed. That was my first lesson, even when no one is watching, you can still police yourself. As I got older, the world narrowed. Middle school was where masculinity became a currency. Boys traded in it. They used it to buy safety. They spent it to impress each other. And they punished anyone who looked like he couldn't afford it. I wasn't bullied in the obvious way. I was smart enough, careful enough, athletic enough to avoid being targeted outright. But I lived with the constant calculation, how to move, how to speak, how to laugh. I learned to laugh at things that didn't feel funny because laughter meant I belonged to the group. I learned to talk about girls the way the other boys talked about girls, even when what I felt was less like conquest and more like admiration mixed with envy mixed with confusion. I didn't envy women's bodies in the simplistic way people think. I envied what they were allowed to express. The freedom to be soft, the permission to be emotionally fluent, the permission to care about appearance without it being treated as weakness. I watched girls comfort each other in hallways and I felt like I was observing a language I wasn't allowed to speak. At home, I became more disciplined. I worked out. I deepened my voice deliberately. I watched how men stood and tried to stand like that. The more I performed masculinity, the safer I became from external suspicion. But the internal cost was heavy. I started to feel like my life was a job I couldn't quit. I want to be responsible in how I describe this, because I know how easily it can get misunderstood. I wasn't trying to trick anyone. I wasn't trying to live a double life to hurt people. I was trying to survive the version of myself that everyone expected, while a quieter version waited behind the scenes, hoping someday it would be allowed on stage without being booed off. In high school, I dated a little, awkwardly. I cared about the girls I dated, but I felt like I was constantly acting in the relationship. Not because I didn't like them, but because I didn't know how to be known. I didn't know how to let someone see me without immediately imagining them stepping back in confusion or disgust. I carried two fears at once. One was the fear of being discovered. The other was the fear that there was nothing to discover, that I was just broken in some vague way, that my private longing was proof of some defect in my character. When you grow up in an environment where masculinity is treated like a moral requirement, any deviation can feel like a sin even if no one ever says the word. I found the internet, as many people do, and it gave me information but not peace. There were stories and forums and labels, and at first I clung to them like life rafts. But it also created another problem. It made everything feel like it had to fit into a category. Am I this? Am I that? Do I qualify? Do I belong? And because I was terrified of making a mistake, I did what I always did, I postponed. I told myself I would figure it out later. Later became a habit. College was my first real taste of freedom, and freedom is not always soothing. It can be destabilizing. Without the familiar walls, you discover how much of your identity was built as a response to pressure rather than desire. I lived with roommates who were decent guys, not cruel, but casually dismissive of anything they didn't understand. Their jokes were the kind you could pretend were harmless until you realized they were also training you to stay silent. I learned quickly which topics made the room go quiet in a tense way. I learned that even in open-minded spaces, masculinity still had borders. But college also gave me my first close friendships with women as equals, not just as romantic targets. In study groups and late-night cafeteria conversations, I saw how they spoke about their lives, the constant negotiation of safety, the way their bodies were public property for strangers' opinions, the complicated relationship they had with appearance. I listened more than I spoke. The more I listened, the more I realized I didn't want to appropriate their experience. I wasn't trying to claim the hardships I hadn't lived. What I wanted was something simpler and harder to justify. I wanted permission to be more fully myself. It wasn't until after college that the main shift happened, and it happened in a way that still surprises me because it wasn't dramatic. It was interpersonal. It was one person meeting me accurately. I was 25 when I met her. I'll call her Mara, not because that's her name but because I want to protect her privacy and also because Mara fits the way I remember her, short, decisive, clear-eyed. She was a few years older than me. She worked in the same building, different department. We kept passing each other in the lobby, exchanging polite nods. One afternoon, the elevator stalled between floors for maybe 2 minutes. It wasn't a crisis, but it was enough time to become aware of the other person's breathing. We were alone in that metal box with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly tired. I did what I always did when I felt tension, I made a joke. She smiled, but she didn't laugh the way people laugh when they want to reward you for social competence. Her smile was more like curiosity. She looked at me as if she could see the machinery under the performance. "What's your real voice?" she asked. I blinked. "That is my real voice." "No," she said, calmly, almost kindly. "That's your public voice." My heart started doing that old panicky thing, as if she'd opened a closet door I'd spent my life holding shut. I tried to recover with another joke, but it came out strained. She watched me for a moment, and then, as if deciding to make the air safer, she said, "I don't mean it as an insult. I mean you're working very hard. I can feel it." The elevator jerked and started moving again, and the moment could have ended there, filed away as a weird interaction. But when the doors opened, she stepped out and turned back to me. "If you ever want to have coffee," she said, "not as a date. Just as a person who doesn't feel like auditioning all the time. I'm around." Then she walked away. I stood there with my hands slightly trembling, and I felt angry for reasons I didn't understand. Angry that she'd noticed. Angry that she'd said it out loud. Angry that it felt true. I didn't take her up on it immediately. Avoidance is my oldest skill. But over the next weeks, I found myself looking for her in the lobby without admitting I was looking. I replayed her words while brushing my teeth, while driving, while staring at my phone late at night. Public voice. Working hard. Auditioning. Eventually, I said yes. We met at a small cafe across the street from our building. I chose a table near the window because it felt safer to be visible, as if being seen by strangers would keep me from being seen too deeply by her. Mara arrived on time, ordered without fuss, and sat down like she belonged everywhere she went. She asked me ordinary questions first: where I grew up, what I studied, what kind of work I did. She listened in a way that made me feel like she was collecting a map, not just facts. When I answered, I noticed myself tightening my posture, deepening my voice, choosing words carefully. After a while, she said, "Can I tell you an impression?" My stomach tightened. "Sure. You're very good at being what you think people will find acceptable," she said. "And it looks exhausting." I felt heat rise in my face. "I don't know what you mean." She nodded as if she expected that answer. "Okay. Let me ask differently. When do you feel at ease? Not productive. Not impressive. Not safe. Ease." I didn't know how to answer. That's what stunned me. I could tell you my goals, my skills, my plans. I could tell you what made other people comfortable. But I couldn't tell you what made me at ease. The absence of an answer felt like a kind of grief. Mara didn't pounce on the silence. She just waited. That was the first thing she taught me: patience can be a form of respect. Finally I said, "When I'm alone, I guess." She tilted her head. "Alone doing what?" I almost lied. Almost gave a neutral answer. "Reading. Watching movies. Cleaning." But my chest felt tight, like my body was asking me not to run away this time. "I don't know," I said. "Just being alone." Mara looked at me for a long time, and then she said, very softly, "There's something you're protecting. I'm not asking you to tell me. I'm asking you to consider whether protecting it has become the same thing as imprisoning it." I stared at my coffee until the surface stopped trembling. Looked like a small wardrobe for someone who wanted to feel comfortable, not someone who wanted to be a spectacle. My hands hovered over the fabric. My eyes blurred. "I can't," I whispered. "You can," Mara said. "But you don't have to. I'll look ridiculous." "Maybe," she said. "And maybe ridiculous is survivable." I laughed once, a short broken sound. "That's a strange encouragement." "It's honest," she replied. "I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the steadiness in her face. Maybe it was how tired I was. Maybe it was the memory of my 8-year-old self standing in front of that closet door like it was a portal. I stood up. Mara didn't watch like it was entertainment. She turned slightly away, giving me privacy without leaving. Another lesson: dignity matters in moments of vulnerability. I changed in her bathroom. My hands fumbled with the fabric. When I pulled the sweater over my head, it brushed my cheeks in a way that made my throat tighten. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a caricature. I saw a person who looked unfamiliar and also strangely relieved. The relief scared me more than the fear had. Fear was familiar. Relief suggested a truth. I stepped out. Mara looked at me, and her expression didn't dramatize it. She simply nodded, like she was recognizing something. "How do you feel?" she asked. I searched for the right word, the honest word, the word that didn't make me sound foolish. "Quieter," I said. Mara smiled gently. "Good. That's usually a sign." We didn't make it into a big event. We talked. We ate dessert. We watched a documentary. We laughed at ordinary things. And all the while, I felt this steady hum inside me, like my nervous system was finally allowed to stop shouting. When I went home that night, the old panic returned at the edges. What did this mean? Was I becoming someone else? Was I betraying the person I'd been? Was I lying to the world? Mara texted me later, "You did something brave tonight. Not because you wore different clothes. Because you listened to yourself." I stared at that message for a long time. Brave. It didn't feel brave. It felt necessary. Over the next year, Mara became a kind of mirror I hadn't had before. Not a mirror that told me what I should be, but a mirror that reflected me accurately when I distorted myself. She would say things like, "You disappear when you talk about your childhood," or "You get louder when you're scared," or "You apologize for existing." Each observation was a small light turned on in a room I'd been stumbling through. She also challenged me, gently and persistently, to stop treating femininity as a private guilty pleasure and start treating it as a human dimension. She framed it not as a secret identity, but as a set of needs and expressions that were already mine. One evening, we sat in her living room and she said, "I want you to think about the difference between shame and privacy." I frowned. "Aren't they the same?" "No," she said. "Privacy is choosing what you share because you respect yourself. Shame is hiding because you believe you're unworthy. Privacy has boundaries. Shame has walls." That sentence lodged in me like a seed. I started making small changes. Not public ones at first. I bought my own clothes, simple things. Softer fabrics. Colors I liked. I wore them at home. I learned how to care for them, how to fold them, how to treat them as normal, not contraband. I started journaling regularly, and I started noticing patterns. My anxiety spiked when I felt trapped in a masculine role, my mood improved when I allowed myself softness, my self-hatred surged when I treated my needs like a moral failure. I also started therapy. That was not a dramatic moment either. It was a practical one. I realized that Mara, for all her wisdom, could not be my entire support system. That would be unfair to her and unstable for me. Personal responsibility meant building a wider foundation. Therapy was where I learned to speak about my identity without turning it into a courtroom trial. I didn't have to prove anything. I didn't have to reach a verdict. I could explore. I could describe. I could change my mind. I could hold complexity. One of the most important things my therapist said to me was, "You are allowed to be in process." That idea felt almost revolutionary. In my upbringing, you were either correct or incorrect. Strong or weak. A man or not. There was no room for process. No room for evolution. But life is process. Identity is process. Self-respect is process. As I became more honest with myself, the biggest tension shifted from internal to relational. It's one thing to admit something privately. It's another thing to decide what to do with that truth in a world that might not welcome it. I had friends, coworkers, family. I had a reputation. I had a carefully constructed masculinity that kept me safe. The prospect of changing it felt like risking everything at once. Mara never pressured me to come out in any particular way. She didn't treat disclosure as the goal. She treated integrity as the goal. Sometimes integrity meant speaking. Sometimes it meant waiting. Sometimes it meant choosing the right people. What would happen, she asked me once, if you stopped seeing this as a secret to reveal and started seeing it as a life to build? A life to build. That language made it feel less like a confession and more like a direction. The first person I told was not my father. It wasn't even my mother. It was a close friend, a guy I'd known since college. I chose him because he was kind in quiet ways. He checked on people. He wasn't obsessed with proving himself. We sat on my couch. I had rehearsed the conversation in my head 100 times, and all those rehearsals fell apart the moment I opened my mouth. I need to tell you something about me, I said, and my voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger. He looked concerned. Are you okay? I don't know, I admitted. I'm trying to be. Then I told him, not in labels, but in experience. I told him about the closet, the panic, the relief, the shame, the friendship with Mara, the therapy. I told him that sometimes I wore women's clothing because it made me feel closer to myself, calmer, more honest. I told him I wasn't asking him to understand everything instantly. I was asking him to see me as a whole person. He was quiet for a long time. My body braced for rejection. Then he said, "Thank you for trusting me." I exhaled so hard it felt like I'd been holding my breath for years. He asked questions, some clumsy, some thoughtful. I answered what I could. Where I didn't know, I said I didn't know. That was new too, not knowing didn't kill me. When he left that night, I sat alone and realized something important. Acceptance wasn't a dramatic fireworks moment. It was a series of small choices by people to keep treating you as human. Not everyone responded like that. A second friend I told grew distant, not hostile, just absent. He stopped inviting me to things. He stopped replying quickly. He didn't say, "I disapprove." He said nothing, which in some ways hurt more because it made my honesty feel like it had contaminated the friendship. I learned another lesson then: you can do everything respectfully and still lose people. That loss isn't always evidence that you did something wrong. Sometimes it's evidence that the relationship was built on a narrower version of you than you realized. The hardest conversation was my family. I waited a long time, partly out of fear, partly out of strategy. I wanted to be stable enough that their reactions wouldn't destroy me. I wanted to have support in place. I wanted to have language. Mara helped me prepare, not by scripting my words, but by grounding me. Remember, she said, you're not asking for permission to exist. You're sharing information about who you are. Their feelings are real, and you can respect them, but you don't have to surrender your life to manage them. I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel. I felt like I was driving toward judgment. My mother hugged me, asked if I was eating enough, the usual things. My father nodded, asked about work. We sat in the living room where I'd learned so many of those unspoken rules. The air felt thick with history. I told my mother first, while my father was in the kitchen. I asked her to sit with me. She looked alarmed before I even said anything, as if she could sense the shape of trouble. "Mom," I said, "I need to tell you something about me. It's not dangerous. But it's important." Her eyes filled immediately, which startled me. "Are you sick?" "No," I said quickly. "No. It's about who I am. About something I've been hiding." She pressed her hand to her mouth. I told her carefully, emphasizing that it wasn't sexual, that it was about comfort and identity and self-understanding. I told her that I'd been in therapy, that I was taking care of myself, that I wasn't spiraling. She listened, crying quietly. When I finished, she said, "Did I do something wrong?" That question broke my heart. Because it revealed how parents often translate their children's truth into their own guilt. "No," I said. "You didn't do something wrong. This is just me. And I've been scared to let you see it." She nodded, still crying. "I don't understand it," she whispered. "But I love you." That was not a perfect response. It wasn't instant comprehension. But it was love, and it was honest about limits. I could work with that. Then my father came back in. I told him. I won't pretend I handled it calmly. My voice shook. My hands shook. I felt like a child again. My father stared at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. Then his face hardened in a way I recognized from childhood, the face of a man encountering something he couldn't control. "No," he said. Just one word, like a verdict. "I'm not asking you to like it," I said, trying to stay steady. "I'm telling you the truth about me." "That's not you," he said, louder. "That's some idea you picked up. That's internet nonsense." I felt anger rise, and behind it grief. "It's me," I said. "It's been me." He stood up, pacing. "So what, you think you're a woman now?" I took a breath, remembering therapy, remembering process. "I'm exploring," I said. "I'm trying to live honestly. I'm not making dramatic claims. I'm not doing this to hurt anyone." He pointed at me like I'd insulted him personally. "You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing this family." My mother cried harder. I wanted to protect her from the conflict, and I also wanted to protect myself from being erased. I said, quietly, "I'm not responsible for your embarrassment. I'm responsible for my integrity." My father's eyes narrowed. "Integrity?" "Yes," I said. "Because lying every day isn't integrity. Pretending isn't integrity. I'm trying to stop pretending." He looked at me with something like disgust and fear mixed together, and I realized in that moment that his masculinity was not just a preference. It was his shelter. My truth threatened the shelter he'd built his whole life inside. The conversation ended badly. He didn't throw me out. He didn't yell for hours. He did something more cutting, he withdrew. He stopped speaking. He sat in his chair and stared at the television as if I had become static. I left with my mother hugging me at the door, whispering, "Give him time." I drove home shaking. I pulled over once to breathe because my hands were trembling too much to safely drive. That was a real consequence. This was not a fantasy narrative where honesty instantly fixes everything. Sometimes honesty breaks things first. For weeks afterward, my father didn't call. My mother called quietly, telling me he was angry, that he wouldn't discuss it, that she was trying. I felt guilty for causing pain, then angry for feeling guilty, then sad that my life seemed to require hurting people just to be real. Mara sat with me in that grief without trying to turn it into a moral triumph. "This is the cost," she said gently. "Not because you did wrong. Because your family has a system. And you changing changes the system." I started to understand something important. My father's reaction was his responsibility, but my approach had to be mine. I didn't want to punish him. I didn't want to perform righteousness. I wanted boundaries and compassion at the same time, which is hard. So I wrote him a letter. Not a dramatic letter. A plain one. I told him I loved him. I told him I wasn't trying to shame him. I told him I understood that he might never understand me. I told him I hoped we could find a way to relate as two human beings instead of as a role and a rule. I didn't mention clothes in detail. I didn't debate. I didn't argue. I focused on what mattered. I was still his child, and I was trying to live responsibly. He didn't respond right away. But months later, my mother told me he'd kept the letter in his bedside drawer. That detail mattered more than any argument we could have had. It meant he hadn't thrown it away. During that time, my own life kept evolving. I started experimenting with integrating femininity not as a secret hobby but as part of how I moved through the world. That didn't mean I suddenly presented in a completely different way at work. I was careful. I considered safety. I considered context. Moral responsibility includes practical responsibility. But I let myself make changes that were subtle and meaningful. I cared for my skin. I chose clothes that felt more like mine, even if they were technically from the men's section. I allowed my gestures to be natural. I stopped forcing my voice downward. I practiced speaking with emotional clarity instead of hiding behind jokes. The most surprising outcome was how my mental health shifted. My anxiety didn't vanish, but it became more understandable. It was no longer this mysterious fog. It had sources. When I felt myself tightening, I could ask, what am I afraid of right now? Who am I performing for? What would it look like to choose honesty instead of safety in this one small moment? Sometimes honesty did mean safety. Sometimes the honest choice was to wait, to keep something private because the environment wasn't safe or because I didn't have the energy for a battle that day. The difference was that I stopped treating privacy as proof that I was ashamed. Privacy became a tool, not a prison. Mare remained steady through all of this, but our relationship shifted too. At some point I realized I had started to rely on her approval in ways that were risky. Even good support can become a substitute for self-trust if you aren't careful. So I told her. I'm grateful, I said one evening as we walked through a park, leaves crunching under our shoes. But I need to make sure I'm not turning you into my compass. She looked at me, pleased. Good, she said. I was waiting for you to say that. I frowned. You were? Yes, she said. Because it means you're growing. I'm not here to define you. I'm here to remind you that you're allowed to define yourself. That was, in a strange way, the heart of what she'd been doing all along. Feminized, if I used the word the way you described it, wasn't about making me into something artificial. It was about guiding me toward a part of myself I had disowned. It was about teaching me that softness could be strength, that care could be courage, that authenticity could be practical. Years passed in small steps. My father eventually spoke to me again. Not an apology, not a heartfelt embrace. Just a call where he asked about work, asked if my car was running okay, spoke in that utilitarian language he trusted. I answered, grateful and cautious. Over time, he stopped treating the topic like a bomb and started treating it like weather, something he didn't control, something he didn't discuss much, but something he could live with existing. One day, during a visit, he saw a bag in my car with a scarf visible at the top. He stared at it for a moment, then looked away. He didn't say anything. Silence can be cruelty, but sometimes silence is also the best someone can do when they're learning. I chose to interpret it as progress, not permission but tolerance, and sometimes tolerance is the first fragile bridge. My mother, over time, became more curious. She asked questions. She made mistakes. She worried about my safety. She asked if I was lonely. Those questions were rooted in love, even when they were awkward. I learned to reassure her without shrinking myself. I told her about therapy. I told her about the friends who stayed. I told her about the friends who didn't. I told her I was learning to build a life, not a disguise. I also learned how to talk about this without treating it as a confession that required forgiveness. That was a big shift. When you've lived in shame, you speak as if you're on trial. You offer explanations too quickly. You apologize for being complicated. But complexity isn't a crime. It's human. The more integrated I became, the more I realized that crossdressing, for me, was never the end goal. It was a doorway. It was a way to access feelings I'd shut down. It was a way to practice being gentle with myself. It was a way to explore identity without rushing to conclusions. I met other people along the way who were on similar journeys, each with different outcomes. Some identified as men who simply enjoyed feminine expression. Some eventually understood themselves as transgender. Some moved between categories, and some rejected categories entirely. What I learned from them, and from myself, was that the healthiest stories weren't the ones with the cleanest labels. The healthiest stories were the ones with the most honesty and the most respect for reality. Respect for reality meant acknowledging consequences. It meant not blaming the world for everything, but also not gaslighting myself into thinking the world was always kind. It meant developing coping strategies that were grounded: therapy, supportive friendships, journaling, movement, boundaries, practical safety planning. It meant learning how to regulate my nervous system when fear surged, how to tell the difference between danger and discomfort, how to recover when someone reacted badly. It also meant building empathy for people who didn't understand, without letting their lack of understanding become my cage. Empathy doesn't require self-erasure. It requires seeing the full picture: my father's fear, my mother's worry, my friend's limitations, my own scars, Mara's patience, my own responsibility to keep moving toward wholeness. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, even in small ways, I want to offer something that I wish someone had offered me earlier. You don't have to turn your life into an argument. You don't have to win a debate with your existence. You can be careful and still be true. You can take small steps and still be courageous. You can explore without rushing to define. And you deserve support that doesn't sensationalize you or reduce you to a stereotype. The world is noisy about gender. It tells you there are only two scripts, and you must pick one and perform it perfectly. But real people are not scripts. We're layered. We're shaped by family, culture, fear, love, loss, longing. We grow. We contradict ourselves. We heal unevenly. And sometimes the bravest thing you do is not a grand announcement, but a quiet commitment to stop abandoning yourself in private. These days, my life looks ordinary from the outside. I work. I pay bills. I visit my parents. I meet friends for coffee. I still have anxiety sometimes. I still have days when I feel the old reflex to tighten up, to lower my voice, to hide my hands, to become the version of myself that never gets questioned. But now I can notice that reflex with kindness instead of contempt. And I still think about Mara, about that elevator, about her question, "What's your real voice?" I understand now that my real voice isn't just a pitch or a style. It's the part of me that doesn't apologize for existing. It's the part that can say, "This is who I am today, and I'm learning, and I'm trying to live with integrity." I don't know what the future holds. Identity, for me, remains a living thing, not a solved puzzle. But I know this: I'm no longer building a masculinity to hide inside. I'm building a life I can inhabit. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.